Je vais maintenant vous présenter une étude que j'ai pu mener au Mali.
So I'm now going to present a study that I carried out in the Mali and for which I was led to go to interview the farmers. So to give you an idea of the context of the study, we're looking at the agroforestry parks in West Africa. This is a system for land use which is traditionally implemented by farmers and has been for generations. And these agroforestry parks have been deteriorating for the past few years. And more precisely, there is an aging of the trees within these parks. A decrease in density of trees, in particular due to the pressure of use on behalf of the population, whose numbers are increasing. Whereas these parks are very important for local populations, we call them ligneous species with multiple use because they provide populations of farmers with products on one side. These might be food products, fruit or leaves, and also provide them with forage for their cattle. It provides them with wood energy, which is their only source of available energy, in particular for cooking. These trees also provide services, and in particular allow to improve the fertility of soil, which is very important for farmers in this area, because generally the soils are very deteriorated and have very low fertility. So these trees are very important for the population, and we are seeing a decrease in density. The decrease in density of trees in this area represents a deterioration of agroforestry parks, and this deterioration itself is a threat for the production capacity of farmers and also for food safety of the populations in these areas. So within this setting of a deterioration of a park, a European project was set up, and it gathers together different international research units. And to be simple, this project aims to improve agroforestry parks and to ensure that the park's trees can provide as many functions for the population of products and services to the population as possible. Within this project, the goal of my study was to take an interest in local knowledge and skills. So the skills of the local population regarding the functions of ligneous species and the functional characteristics of these species. So within this scope, I went to visit the farmers, to lead the interviews and collect local know-how. To respond to the objectives that I was to attain, I established research questions and the corresponding research hypotheses. So I'm going to now describe these to you. We have one main research question and one main research hypothesis that corresponds to this, and then two sub-questions with two sub-hypotheses. The main question of my study was, within the framework of the deterioration of agroforestry parks, what function do ligneous species of these parks fulfill for the farmers in the area of Tibi in Mali? This area was where I carried out the studies. Two sub-questions with regard to this main question. The first, what do the farmers use these ligneous species for? And the second, what is the farmer's representation of the functional characteristics of ligneous species? The correspondence to these three questions were three hypotheses. The main hypothesis, the first one therefore, is in the case of farmers, ligneous species provide a series of products and services. And the two sub-hypotheses with regard to this first main hypothesis, farmers use these species to obtain products and services, quite simply. And the second hypothesis, the farmers have their own representation of the functional characteristics of ligneous species, and these representations vary according to their personal experience and, in particular, family learning, level of education, or the ethnic group. The research hypothesis that I formulate might appear to be quite simple, but when you're doing this type of work, it's better to set off from rather simple research hypotheses and then maybe clarify these during the study rather than setting off with very complicated hypotheses from the outset that require a lot of variables to be informed and which might create difficulties for the work in the field. So the research questions and the hypotheses that I've just mentioned were established before setting off into the field in Mali to carry out the interviews. But these are the hypotheses and questions that I referred to during this field work to carry out the interviews amongst the farmers, and they represented the methodological framework of my study in Mali. To answer these questions and these hypotheses, the next step is to determine the variables that we will be studying, the variables of the study, in order to answer these questions and to confirm or infirm the hypotheses that have been established. So, to begin with, to determine my variables, I based this on three different areas of studies that are relevant to my subject. The first was the diversity of agroforestry systems that we can find in the Tibi area in Mali. The second was how the farms operate in this area. And the third was how the linear species operate and the farmers' representations as to the functional characteristics of these species. So it's really in this latter area that I will precisely enter into what was ordered in the project from the outset. So for each of these areas, I determined a certain number of variables. For example, to study the diversity of agroforestry systems, I established as variables the type of landscape unit that we can find in the area, the evolution of the linear species populations within the area. Concerning the way the farms operate, I took an interest, for example, in variables such as crop rotation in the farms, or the status of the farmers that operated these farms. Finally, concerning the function of linear species and the functional characteristics of these species, I took an interest in the product-service variables, products and services stemming from linear species, or the biological characteristics of the species that have a link with the given functions. So I'm now going to speak to you more specifically of the interview guide and give you a quick example of how we move from the variables that I've just mentioned to the formulation of the questions in the interview guide. What we must know here is that all of the variables that we defined upstream of the study are not necessarily directly informed by a question in the interview guide. And inversely, a question from the interview guide can inform different variables at once. And once we have written our entire interview guide, we must be able to inform all of the variables that we established upstream of the fieldwork. Before we set off into the field, and after formulating my hypothesis questions and establish my variables, I draw up a first interview guide for the interviews that I will be carrying out in Mali. And now I'm going to show you how this interview guide changed from the guide that I wrote before I went into the field and the one that I actually used for the interviews with the farmers. To illustrate this, I'm going to look at one main variable, which is the farmer variable. We can also call this a meta variable. And this variable includes several sub-variables, which must be informed in the interview guide for my study. These sub-variables are the origins of the farmer, so the ethnic group, and the fact that he was born in the village where he lives or not. Another sub-variable of the farmer variable was the activity aspect, his main activity or main activities, and his secondary activity or activities. And a final sub-variable of the farmer meta-variable was everything linked to education, so that his education and professional training that he might have done during his life. So to illustrate how the interview guide changed during the study, I have before my eyes here the three main steps of the evolution of my interview guide, and you'll be able to find this on the platform. The first stage is the one that I talked of, the interview guide that I drew up before I set off into the field. The second stage was when I was already in the field. For 1 week, we went to visit farmers where we tested our interview guide, and we translated with Malian colleagues and tested them with the farmers. It was a test phase of the interview guide. And the final stage was the final interview guide, the one that I actually used to go and interview the farmers, the operational interview guide. To come back on the second stage in the evolution of my interview guide, I must underline the translation of the guide, which is a very important step. And this took place just before we tested the interview guide with the farmers. And this translation step requires a lot of time, and we must be very diligent at this stage to make sure that the translation has really properly understood what question we want to ask the farmer, and to make sure that the questions are sufficiently clear for the farmers who will be interviewed. To illustrate this evolution, I will be quoting one particular question which generated a certain number of problems upon the translation and testing phase of the interview guide. And it was all the more important that it was the first question of the guide, so the question that really leads us into the interview with the farmer. The question was, what is your personal background? That was the question that I wrote down before I set off to Mali. And with using the opinion of my translator, we realized that this question was not appropriate for the farmers that we would be meeting. Therefore, we formulated another question, which was translated word for word by the translator in the test interviews. And this question was, what is your story? Just so that the farmer introduced himself. So we went from an inappropriate question, what is your personal background, to a question which we thought was more appropriate, what is your story? This question, what is your story, after the first interviews done with the farmers, we realized that it was not sufficiently clear. The farmers didn't see what we were getting at. They didn't answer the question, and they always asked us to specify what the question was. So with the help of my translator, we once again formulated a new question and translated it as it was. This question was quite simply, can you introduce yourself? After different interviews led with the farmers, it is this final question, can you introduce yourself, that was the most relevant to carry out the interviews with the farmers. A second example of the possible evolution of questions within an interview guide, the initial question, which people are present on the farm, was far more too general for the farmers. And this was split into two different questions. The first, how many people do you have in your family? And the second, how many people work on your farm? And the questions that I've just mentioned are general questions that initiate discussions with the farmers. In our interview guide, we must also have relaunch questions in the event that we don't receive the information we're looking for from these main general questions, and which allow the farmer to clarify his thoughts and his presentation. To come back to my very first example, the initial question, what is your personal background? To clarify this question, we had the relaunch question, what are your origins? And this relaunch question, once again, turned out to be not very clear to the farmers, because in the origins of the farmers of this region, there are two aspects, the ethnic aspect and the native or non-native aspect of the farmer. So we had to split this relaunch question, what are your origins, into two questions. First question, what is your ethnic group? And second, how long have you been living in this village? As an example of what can be discussed with the translator during the interview guide translation phase, I can mention once again the question, what are your origins? When we wanted to clarify this question, the translator told me that it was not polite to ask a person the precise place where they were born. To ask a farmer, where were you born, was something which was very poorly viewed in the region. And therefore, instead of precisely asking for the place of birth, we were asking the question, How long have you been living in the village for? So with this question, how long have you been living in this village, we could inform our subvariable, the native or non-native characteristic of the farmer. The farmer was led to speak of his past, the different places that he lived in. And what is important in this question was not to know precisely where the farmer was born, but really to understand if the farmer was native or non-native to the village in which we were leading the interviews. So the work on this final question shows the link that we must maintain between the final question of the interview guide, our subvariables and our variables identified at the beginning of the study, to check the relevance of the questions, and this allows us to check the relevance of our variables and subvariables, and to check the relevance of our variables allows us once again to come back to our research hypothesis and to make sure that these hypotheses correspond to the situation in the field. We must remember that this work to refine the questions in the interview guide must not make the guide too heavy. We're not going to go into the field with a questionnaire which is 20 pages long, but we must have an interview guide that is controllable and that can be in one page only.